Professor Tariq Modood from the University of Bristol in England, where I'm the director of the Centre for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. And I've been working on multiculturalism with special reference to British Muslims since the late 1980s, so that's over 30 years. I have many publications. The best known is my book, which is called Multiculturalism, a Civic Idea. And I've helped to nurture here at Bristol University what has been called the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. My lecture is on modes of integration, multiculturalism, and national identities. The topic has become very important in countries such as the US, Canada, Australia, Western Europe, including Britain. Namely, countries that experienced significant migration from former colonies and the global south, more generally, the global south more generally, after the Second World War, such that those migrants and their children and grandchildren are now citizens of those countries. This raises the question of what equal citizenship means in the context of this post-colonial, ethno-racial and ethno-religious context. And that is exactly what my lecture is about. So, my first slide you'll see is about integration, and integration presupposes difference. That is to say that there's something about some citizens that stands out. And of course the things I'm interested in are to do with race, ethnicity, religion, and so on. And the issue then becomes, how are citizens to be integrated, as we say? And the key issue here is to do with their identities, because citizens have a civic identity, of course, and they have a number of personal, individual identities, but they also have group identities, and it's these group identities that we refer to when we talk about difference. And an identity, like being British Asian, like being French Muslim, or Black American, these identities have two aspects that you'll see from the slide I call from the outside in and from the inside out. So from the outside in means other people, usually the rest of society, because we're talking about minorities here, so it's the dominant groups in society. They have a view on what your identity is. They, in some respects, make your identity. They make the identity of minorities. For instance, by saying you are black, or you are Asian, or you are Muslim, when actually you may not have been so sure that that's what your important identity was. But how society looks at you is an important dimension of how we form our own identities. But it's not the only source that our identities are made by. Because, as I say, there's also from the inside out. Because we all, including minorities and including relatively powerless minorities, have a sense of what it is to be who we are. We have a sense of who we are. We have a sense of what it is to be British, to be a British Muslim, to be Black British, and so on. And our identities, our minority identities that we refer to as difference, consists of both these aspects combined together. And of course they interact and shape each other. We're influenced by how society treats us and how they recognize us or fail to recognize us, what's called misrecognition. But at the same time, we project and assert our identities, the identities that we think are true to us or we aspire to live by, and society sometimes accommodates that. It shapes its perceptions, changes its perceptions in the light of that. And so multiculturalism seeks recognition, inclusion, and accommodation of this from the inside identity, the sense of who we are, whilst opposing the dominating identity, that's to say the identity that comes from dominant groups, from the outside. That is the multiculturalist form of integration. It presupposes that difference, but it emphasizes the importance of what minorities think of their identities and allowing those minorities, those identities to become the identities of the public space, of the shared society and political life. I turn to my next slide, which is about integration, and I say there that integration has 3 levels. So the first level you'll see I'm calling everyday cultural encounters, how we get on with people in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, in public spaces, whether they be public transport, parks, cafes, and so on. The next level is what I call sectoral or legal. For example, the legal status that people have, that minority individuals and groups may have, the rights that they have, their position in the labor market, in neighborhoods where there's perhaps residential concentration, in some deprived neighborhoods, inner cities and so on, sometimes what's called segregation. So that's a second level of integration. But I want to say that integration is incomplete without this third level, which I call macro-symbolic, as you can see from the slide. And what I mean by that is captured by the quote on the slide from a Canadian commission that was chaired by Gerard Bouchard and Charles Taylor, published in 2008. And the quote is, "The symbolic framework of integration," that's to say identity, religion, perception of the other, collective memory, and so on, "is no less important than its functional or material framework." Than the other 2 levels, the everyday encounters and the legal status, residential and workplace statuses and treatments and possible discriminations and so on. So I'm going to focus on this third level, this macro-symbolic. Every society has a sense of what it is and where it's going and where it's coming from and who its members are and how they are united and divided and so on. And that's all part of this macro-symbolic sense, and therefore integration is incomplete till minority citizens marked by difference, engage with and are part of this macro-symbolic level. So turning to the next slide, I say there that there are 4 modes of integration, and I'm thinking about just this macro-symbolic level. You'll see that I call them assimilation, individualist integration, cosmopolitanism, and multiculturalism. Well, what do I mean by these four modes of integration? Well, I explain these by the table, which you can see on the screen now. And what I've done in this table of these four modes of integration is that I've broken them down by saying, okay, so what is it that each mode of integration regards as the object of policy? And you can see the first row is on that. So assimilation is concerned with individuals and groups marked by difference. Individualist integration is concerned with that, but especially their treatment by discriminatory practices of state and civil society. Moving on to the next one, cosmopolitanism is all that, but especially concerned with societal ideas of us and them, and so on. And then finally, multiculturalism is individuals and groups marked by difference, especially their treatment by discriminatory practices of state and civil society and societal ideas, especially of us and them. So basically, the objects of policy for cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism are the same, except for one important difference, which I hope you can see, which I hope you picked up: groups. Multiculturalism is interested in objects of policy of groups in society in the way that cosmopolitan focuses on individuals only. Then, turning to the rest of the table, what I say is, let's think of these modes of integration by the three key concepts of citizenship. You know, the concepts that were part of the French Revolution motto, declarations: liberty, equality, and fraternity. But we could call fraternity solidarity, which is probably a more contemporary meaning. I've kept fraternity just in order to show that I'm dealing with the French Revolutionary triad. And again, we can see that the four modes of integration have their own different understanding of these concepts. Take liberty first. Minorities must be encouraged to conform to the dominant cultural pattern. Individualist integration interprets liberty to mean minorities are free to assimilate or cultivate their identities in private, but are discouraged from thinking of themselves as a minority, but rather as individuals. Cosmopolitanism thinks that liberty is where neither minority nor majority individuals should have to think of themselves as belonging to a single identity, but be free to mix and match. And for multiculturalism, liberty means members of minorities should be free to assimilate, to mix and match, or to cultivate group membership in proportions of their own choice. By proportions, I mean all those things: assimilate, mix and match, and group membership. People should be free to combine those in the ways that they want to, in proportions that they want, in new syntheses that they want. Turning to equality then, for assimilation, equality means presence of difference provokes discrimination and so is to be avoided. So it's a denial of difference. For individualist integration, discriminatory treatment must be actively eliminated, so everyone is treated as an individual and not on the basis of difference. And for cosmopolitanism, anti-discrimination must be accepted by the dethroning of a dominant culture. So we're assuming there is a dominant culture, most societies have one, and for cosmopolitanism, that is the source of the problem. that there is a dominant culture at all. And how can minorities enjoy equality if there's a dominant culture? So the dominant culture has in some sense to be dethroned, its domination to cease. And for multiculturalism, in addition to anti-discrimination, equality means the public sphere must accommodate the presence and new group identities and norms. So multiculturalism is less interested in dethroning the dominant culture, though of course it does involve changing what may be called the dominant culture or the shared culture, public culture, but multiculturalism is more interested in that minorities should be accommodated into the public space, into the public culture, into the macro symbolic understanding of society. The new group identities and norms should be incorporated. And finally, solidarity or fraternity. For assimilation, that means a strong, homogeneous national identity. For individualist integration, it means absence of discrimination and nurturing of individual autonomy within a national, liberal, democratic citizenship. For cosmopolitanism, people should be free to unite across communal and national boundaries and should think of themselves as global citizens. Solidarity for multiculturalism means that citizenship and national identity must be remade to include group identities that are important to minorities as well as majorities. The relationship between groups should be dialogical rather than one of domination and uniformity. So that's what I mean by 4 modes of integration, all with different takes on the 3 key ideas that constitute citizenship: liberty, equality, fraternity, or solidarity. So, moving on to the relationship between multiculturalism and the national, which of course is where I left off the table, because the understanding of solidarity for multiculturalism was about the inclusion of minorities into the national citizenship and the national self-understanding. So, turning to that, multiculturalism, and this is one of its fundamental differences from individualist integration, or perhaps cosmopolitanism, is that multiculturalism does not accept the possibility of the state, including a liberal state, being culturally neutral. It thinks that's an impossible condition. All states, for instance, will have to operate in one or at least a few limited languages, whether it's Bengali or English, French or Spanish. This will make a difference to the political system, to the shared citizenship, whether the citizenship is practiced, lived out in Spanish or in Bengali. A decision has to be made, and all states choose a language, or as I say, perhaps 2 or 3 languages at most, like places like, say, Switzerland. But nevertheless, citizens operate, they talk to each other, laws are written up in a specific language or languages. And that means that the state can't be culturally neutral. It must teach that language in schools. It must raise the levels of proficiency in that language to a high standard, which means that it must cherish and nurture the literary tradition of that language, like the Bengali cultural linguistic tradition, or the English language and Shakespeare and Milton and, English novels and so on become part of what's being taught in English schools and universities and so on. So that's not culturally neutral. That's what the state decides should be taught, and it's paid for out of taxes and so on. So multiculturalism says, okay, there is no cultural neutrality, and minorities shouldn't seek that, but nor should they be excluded from shaping the national culture, the public culture. Multiculturalism works with the idea of multi-level governance or rights. Multi-level, for instance, including the local level, the national level, or the supranational level, which could be the European Union, for instance, though Britain, of course, has just left it, but 27 other members are part of it. Or there could be other levels of supranational governance, for instance, human rights conventions and laws. But this multi-level governance does not mean the devaluing of national citizenship, which remains the primary source of liberty, equality, and fraternity or solidarity. So that's what was coming out of that table that I showed you, that multiculturalism emphasizes the place of the national citizenship in delivering equality, liberty, and solidarity across difference. That is to say, in its mode of integration. So I turn to the last slide. We might say, well, why am I emphasizing national identity? Because yes, citizenship, perhaps, okay, that's a legal concept, it's a legal status. We all have rights as citizens, and they should be the same as each other and so on. But why am I talking about national identity? Well, one reason is that, of course, I'm talking about the accommodation of minorities, not simply about legal statuses and so on, because I'm emphasizing that minorities have cultures and identities, norms and community structures that cannot be ignored when it comes to equality, liberty, and solidarity. They have to be included into any understanding of the national citizenship, including changing our understanding of the national citizenship. But citizenship, which clearly is about belonging, because that's what fraternity means, that we belong together, that, literally speaking, we're brothers, or if you like, brothers and sisters, that we have some concerns for each other. We owe each other certain obligations, in particular obligations of concern for welfare and for, say, protection from various threats, including, say, racial violence or racial harassment. So this sense of belonging together is part of what it means to be a citizen of Bangladesh, or citizen of India, or citizen of France. But citizenship for most people, most of the time, is quite a dry idea, quite a dry concept, quite abstract and obviously legalistic. And I think, like so many other people, that we need something emotional and imaginative to make this solidarity work, to make this belonging work. And that's exactly how national identity and citizenship get entangled together, work together, so that national citizenship is not simply conceived in terms of legal matters and, like rights and duties, what law courts will enforce and so on, but also is a sense of being together, of belonging together as a nation, as a country. And our citizenship, therefore, is wrapped in a story of how it came to be, how it was constructed, the political difficulties, the struggles, because there often are struggles, whether to do with inside the country and political processes like throwing off powerful groups and monarchs and so on, or they're to do with resisting colonialism and forging independence. But there's a national story to be told, and the minorities, for multiculturalists, the newly settled minorities, have to be included into that national story. Of course, in many cases, the minorities, as in Britain and France and so on, are people who are already part of that story because it's an imperial story. So people like my family who come from Pakistan are part of the British story, not the day that we arrive on the shores of this country or at an airport. We're part of the British story that goes back hundreds of years because, of course, the British ruled India and in some respects made us what we are, and their rule of India made the British what they are. We became British. We became part of the British story. Of course, not in terms of liberty, equality and solidarity. In terms of domination, we were the subjects of British rule, but nevertheless we were part of that story. And so that story has to be retold now so that we are seen to be part of that story, and our claims of equal citizenship and of accommodation, cultural and religious accommodation, for instance, and anti-racism are seen to be part of the ongoing national story, which has its origins in history, but which obviously is continuing to develop and hopefully developing in a multiculturalist direction. And that's why multiculturalists put an emphasis on national citizenship and national identity in the way that, for instance, cosmopolitans don't, and that liberal individualists, on the whole, do not either. They're satisfied with legal rights, duties and norms. So the key idea of this lecture is that multiculturalism is a mode of citizenship integration. It differs from other modes of integration, such as assimilation, individualist integration and cosmopolitanism. Like them, however, it can be understood in terms of liberty, equality and fraternity or solidarity. But group identities are to be included in citizenship integration. This is a key difference for multiculturalism, often absent in other modes of integration. That group identities are to be included, and citizenship is understood as an inclusive and multiculturalist form of national belonging. There are some further readings that I've recommended that will be supplied to you if you're interested in following up these ideas further and seeing how people have discussed them. And there are also 3 questions for discussion, which I'm sure the MOOC organizers will make available to you. So that is my lecture. I hope that it has been of interest to you and that it makes sense. Thank you very much.